nu gewoon.
Dat is nu gewoon.
Ja.
Ja. Ook bijzonder hoe snel dan al iets gewoon wordt. Hè?
Nou ja, een jaar kost het ongeveer. Dan merk je ook wel verschillende snelheden.
Ja. Maar ik vind het dus elk
Yeah. But everybody's ready. I was going to go to coffee, but I don't think go to it. So I don't have to. I can say if you actually possibly start enjoying it.
Ja, eerst doen, ja. Ik moet even mijn PowerPoint. Mag ik dat aan jou vragen voor PowerPoint? Doe maar. Ik nooit wat ik vragen.
Plus il y a une forme qui s'est réalisée.
Alors, c'est en français ou ils l'ont fait exprès? Ils l'ont pas fait exprès. C'est ça que c'est Kevin à Bruxelles.
And that's why I see Australia as kind of having a really important regional opportunity to do those kind of projects across Europe. Yeah, it's really nice. But both be Emmanuel will be happy.
Yes, of course I do. I think you were. So you were. Yeah, I know. Good. It's what I said. Yeah, but Katrina saw this week, and I just say, but wasn't she nothing? Well, I don't know. So, yeah, she wasn't nothing there, wasn't she?
Nee, dat is wel, dat is nu gewoon.
Dat is nu gewoon.
Ja.
Ja. Ook bijzonder hoe snel dan al iets gewoon wordt. Hè?
Nou ja, een jaar kost het ongeveer. Dan merk je ook wel verschillende snelheden.
Ja. Maar ik vind het dus elk
Yeah. But everybody's ready. I was going to go to coffee, but I don't think go to it. So I don't have to. I can say if you actually possibly start enjoying it.
Ja, eerst doen, ja. Ik moet even mijn post gooien. Mag ik dat aan jou vragen voor PowerPoint hoor? Doe maar. Ik moet het niet vragen.
On est d'accord maintenant? Tout le monde est d'accord? Oui. Alors si vous ne croyez pas, regardez un peu le trottoir de gauche et de droite, regardez. Le pied s'enfonce dans le sol comme une fonctionnaire. Regardez là-bas tout au loin, le théâtre, le trottoir.
Il n'est pas au même niveau.
Au fur et à mesure.
Si on rentre par ici, si on rentre par ici, regardez, il ne faut pas monter une marche. Mais plus on avance, plus il y a une pente qui s'est réalisée.
Alors, ils sont enfoncés ou ils l'ont fait exprès? Ils l'ont pas fait exprès. Ce qui se passe ici, c'est que ce terrain artificiel.
And that's where I see Australia as kind of having a really important regional opportunity to do those kind of projects across Europe. Yeah, it's really nice. But both being used for Emmanuel will be happy.
Yes, of course I do. I think you were. So you were. Yeah, I know. Good. It's what I said. Yeah, but Katrina saw this week, and I just say, but wasn't she nothing? Well, I don't know. I said, yeah, she wasn't nothing there, wasn't she?
Nee, dat is wel, dat is nu gewoon.
Dat is niet gewoon.
Ja.
Ook bijzonder hoe snel dan al iets gewoon wordt. Hè?
Nou ja, een jaar kost het ongeveer, dat merk je ook wel, verschillende snelheden.
Ja. Maar ik vind het dus elk
Yeah. But everybody's spreading.
I was going to go to coffee, but I don't think go to it. So I don't have to. I can say
Actually, possibly slightly more anything.
Ja, eerst doen, ja. Ik moet even mijn post gooien. Mag ik dat aan jou vragen voor PowerPoint hoor? Doe maar. Ik moet het niet vragen.
On est d'accord maintenant? Tout le monde est d'accord? Oui. Alors si vous ne croyez pas, regardez un peu le trottoir de gauche et de droite, regardez. Le pied s'enfonce
monter une marche, mais plus on avance, plus il y a une pente qui s'est réalisée.
Alors, c'est en français ou ils l'ont fait exprès? Ils l'ont pas fait exprès. Ce qui se passe, c'est que c'est très rare à Bruxelles.
And that's where I see Australia as kind of having a really important regional opportunity to do those kind of projects across Europe. Yeah, it's really nice. But to both be Emmanuel will be happy.
Yes, of course I do. I think you were. So you were. Yeah, I know. Good. It's what I said. Yeah, but Katrina saw this week, and I just say, but wasn't she nothing? Well, I don't know. I said, yeah, she wasn't nothing there, wasn't she?
Nee, dat is wel, dat is nu gewoon.
Dat is niet gewoon.
Ja.
Ook bijzonder hoe snel dan al iets gewoon wordt. Hè?
Nou ja, een jaar kost het ongeveer, dat merk je ook wel, verschillende snelheden.
Ja. Maar ik vind het dus elk
Yeah. But everybody's spreading.
I was going to go to coffee, but I don't think go to it. So I don't have to. I can say
Actually, possibly slapping you in it.
Ja, eerst te doen, ja. Ik moet even mijn pols gooien. Mag ik dat aan jou vragen op PowerPoint hoor? Doe maar. Ik moet het niet vragen.
On est d'accord maintenant? Tout le monde est d'accord? Oui. Alors si vous ne croyez pas, regardez un peu le trottoir qui touche le bien, regardez. Le bien s'enfonce dans le sol comme une fonctionnaire. Regardez là-bas tout au loin, le théâtre, le trottoir.
il n'est pas au même niveau.
Au fur et à mesure.
Si on rentre par ici, si on rentre par ici, regardez, il ne faut pas monter une marche. Mais plus on avance, plus il y a une pente qui s'est réalisée.
Alors, c'est en français ou ils l'ont fait exprès? Ils l'ont pas fait exprès. Ce qui se passe, c'est que c'est très rare à Bruxelles.
Yes, of course I do. Thank you.
Nee, nog op die plaats.
Maar nu zien we niks. Ah ja.
Nee, die is groen.
Ah, je moet even zenden.
We moeten alleen even starten op het beeld. Het beeld is mee.
Hallo, hallo.
Ja, maar ze waren net precies. Ja, maar dat is de eerste periode van de eeuw.
Good afternoon, all of you, at the meeting, The Art of Valuing, a collaboration today between the Flanders Arts Institute and our host, deBuren, and IETM, International Network for the Contemporary Performing Arts. I'm Nan van Houten, the Secretary General of IETM, and I'm happy to have you all here. Amongst us are 50 people, decision makers, policy makers, funders, representatives of arts councils and ministries of culture that will continue tomorrow to discuss the art of valuing and the value of arts. But today we will concentrate on the value of arts. For the last decades, the term measuring has entered and sometimes even dominated our discussions on arts and cultural policy. And we have measured the numbers of audiences. We have counted the representation of lower income groups, cultural minority groups in the audiences, and we have calculated the economic impact of the cultural industry. In my mother tongue, we have a fixed expression that says, measuring equals knowledge, meten is weten. The question today and tomorrow will be if the yardstick is indeed the best instrument to deepen our knowledge on the value of culture, and if we use the right indicators and the right methodologies to really get to know the impact of our cultural life. For that reason, I'm very happy to introduce to you a person that dedicated his scientific career on the role of arts in society. His book, called De waarde van cultuur, The Value of Culture, has been warmly welcomed both in the Netherlands and in Flanders. Today, the Flanders Arts Institute posted an English summary of this book online. After this afternoon session, you will be able to see all the other publications of Pascal Gielen that will be on sale downstairs. But now I'm very happy to introduce to you, give him a warm welcome, Pascal Gielen.
Thank you, Nan, also for the invitation. I also want to thank Joris and Delphine of Flanders Arts Institute for inviting me here also to give the possibility to speak for this exclusive group, I think. But also to give, more than a year ago, this assignment for doing this research. An assignment which I had doubts with. And immediately from the beginning, because also there the question was from a lot of art centers in Flanders, the question, what is the value of art? Of course, they had in mind immediately what is the effect of art in several fields. You will see also in my lecture this ambivalence stays in my lecture, but we gave also in this research a kind of twist to this whole idea and obsession sometimes I see of measurement. And maybe before I start to frame a little bit my lecture, two things. One side I will go into the report, the research report we did, a kind of inventory of all kind of evidence-based things which were done on research in the field of culture all over Europe. We made a kind of inventory of this. We had 3 months to do this, 30,000 euros, 3 months to collect all the stuff. The other way around, I will think further about what is this research about, what is this doing also with culture, and come up with a more speculative thing, which will be also published in a book which comes out at the end of March, No Culture, No Europe, in which we try to make a more objective, subjective debate about the value of culture in a general sense related to politics. And I mix those two things today in my lecture. But first of all, very basic. When we talk about culture, and we get that, so can you do research on the value of culture? The first question, of course, is very basic. What is culture about? You have to decide as a researcher, what are we talking about when we talk about culture? And so, and now go in a very classic academic definition of what culture is for us. And I think this is very important to start with, because otherwise you can't understand what we measured or what we, how we search for the inventory and what we did not see in the inventory. So for us, culture, we define it very basic anthropologic way of life. It is, for us, culture is are the 3 cups of coffee that I need every morning to get up. That's my culture. That's a kind of thing you need in life. Others don't need it in life. In the Netherlands, I know it's more tea, etc. But this is culture. It's your way of life. It is something what is given from you from birth as a little child by your parents, etc. Education, etc. But what is an important function of culture, I think, is giving meaning to your own personal existence in society. Who am I? What do I do here? And what is this society around me doing? This is the main, I think, important function of culture and how we defined this culture. In the cultural field, the professional sector of theaters, but also education, I think, etc., they are always busy in our eyes with 3 main functions in culture. And the first one is what we call socialization. Socialization, to say it very blunt, means bringing people in a social order. Let them understand the social order. You could call it social integration. It starts again when your parents feed you up from a little child, but it is also what is happening with what we call in Belgium inburgering. For example, people from abroad come to here, they learn the attitudes, they learn how we deal in Belgium with people who come here, what is politeness, etc., etc. This is bringing people in a social order. This is one of the functions education does, but also a lot of cultural actors, cultural organizations in the field. A second thing, what always mostly happens in the cultural field, is process of qualification. Qualification is saying you can dance better than you, because you can lay your leg, for example, higher than another. That's qualification. It's a process. It's also a process of canonization, that you say, this is better, this is where we stand for, and this is a process of hierarchization, etc. Again, education plays a very enormous role in this process of qualification, but also when you are an artist, you know when you go to ask for subsidizing, you come for a jury or an advisory board, they qualify. They say, this is better than this. This is a very important process that is going on and on in this system. The last one, what I think is very important, and which is education, I think, more and more losing to do, is subjectification. What is subjectification about is doing this. It's really giving you a hit in the face and saying, I try to touch people in their existence. It is really to give you kind of twist, say, oh, is this what I am? Is this about? Oh, it's a kind of trying to bring in a kind of shift which touches your existence. It is like the feeling as your first love is broken or something like that. Oh, what happens at that moment? And this is subjectivation process, which the arts, but also in cultural heritage fields, etc., they often try to do. For example, cultural heritage field in museum, by bringing another history of a people, that the people think in another way about their history. This is this process of subjectivation. So subjectivation is not only for me on the individual level, it's also on the collective level. You can subjectivate groups or bunches even. You can. This is a very important process. I think those 3 are the main functions of culture, and this is also what we looked at when we did our research or inventory on culture. So for me, the cultural sector is busy with this. It's social cultural field, it's heritage, it are the arts, but also amateur arts, etc. And all those actors in those fields are in a way busy with what I call, in a reflective way, reflecting about those mechanisms of subjectivation, qualification, and socialization, but they are also at the same time, in the sense, reflecting on how do you sign or living together? What is society about? How can we signify society in which we live, in which we develop? What are the important values we want or not want, etc. So, in a nutshell, what culture is doing and what the cultural field is doing is at one side giving people measures to measure their life, the cup of coffee I need every morning, or the rituals you need in a lifetime, etc. And at the other side, especially the arts, but also again cultural heritage field, etc., is trying to dismeasure. I know it's not good English, that's why it's a dismeasure. This word in Dutch is Naarmate, is also not existing in Dutch, but it means that you bring in something else, another measure, in the way we were used to measure things, to measure our lives, etc. And it is this play, this dialectic, I think, which is very important and which is a very important role for me in the cultural field. For the arts, cultural heritage, sociocultural field, amateur field, etc. Okay, that's one thing. That's, for us, that was our starting point. That's how we defined culture. Now, the question and assignment was, what is the value of culture? And we start to make our inventory all over Europe to look at how is culture measured, what are the specific effects. When you start to doing that, and I have to say I did this with 4 colleagues of mine, and one completely drowned in a huge mess of research, what is done about and what tries to measure these kinds of effects. But at the end, we came out with 5 fields in which those measurements were made. One were, to start with the smallest field of research that we found, was cognitive effects. What is the effect, for example, of learning music on your knowledge of mathematics, for example? How does this affect your knowledge? We found research about it, and we found also empirical proof that culture, in a way, has effects. I go very brief to this, because I think you can all read in the summary about those researches we found. It's a huge list. I think it's 40 pages with all kind of researches we found on this. I want to discuss much more with you the effect of this kind of research in the next page. On health, we found a lot of interesting research. People who read books and are ill are much easier to get well again than people who don't read books and are ill, for example, research, empirical proven. The experiential value is that what really people experience when they go to a performance, for example, and also what they expect what a performance can do. And one important thing is, for example, what I said already, bringing in a kind of confronting yourself with something, bringing in a kind of dismeasure in your life. A lot of people say this, that an exhibition or a performance at a certain moment, or a film can be also at a certain moment, give a twist in their perception of things. Economic effects, you know, I think, a lot of this. We discussed this about gentrification, the function of museums, etc., etc. You can all read this in the report. And the last one is about social cohesion. We found also effects and empirical proof that cultural participation, in a certain way, is improving social cohesion, social integration. Maybe one important remark, because somebody also who worked with me together at the report and is finishing her PhD now on cultural participation and social cohesion. What is interesting, for example, is that there are two ways to define social cohesion. One is what they call bridging, it's getting open for the other, and one is what we call binding. It's more looking at yourself, at the group yourself. What she improves, for example, is that when you are confronted with art, which lets you see strange things and which brings in kind of this measure, is very well in improving this kind of bridging social cohesion. But not art which, for example, which confirms already standards in society. I just say this because it is very nuanced, and you have to nuance it very much, and it's very specific where, under which conditions also, culture can do something in this effect. Anyway, this is the research we found, the fields on which we also found empirical proof. But I have to say also that it is at the other way, or on the other hand, it is also very restricted what you sometimes only can measure in this kind of research. What I want to discuss much more with you, but first I will take some water. Is more what I think, what this research does, what the effect of this research is, and also what the restrictions of this kind of research does, and what it does with also the notion of value of culture. First of all, when you only focus on empirical research, and empirical results, you always are confronted with what I call the causality doxa. This means there is kind of origin and there is an effect, and you have to, in a way, as a researcher, deal with this. When you deal with this with culture, it means that you are always bounded to an event. You have to, for example, measure what happens when you go to look to a theater performance. Before the performance, you have to measure, and after the performance. You always look at an event and what it does. So you are, this means it is very important, this kind of research, there is always a kind of restriction or limiting of time. It's a moment. Before and after the museum was built, for example, before and after the festival. This is very much, I think, in contradiction what culture is about. Habits on the long term, conservation of habits on the long term, which is very difficult in this kind of research to measure. You can do this, you know, probably the system of longitudinal research, but it's very expensive, and there are not so much governments who want to pay for research for 20, 30 years. But culture is about this. It is really about embedding things on the long term. So the problem with all this kind of, most of this kind of research is that it only measures a moment in time and can say almost nothing about what culture is about on the long run. So it looks at clock time, not at what I call the embeddedness of time, the embedded time you need to get attitudes, etc. You isolate also an event. It's an event and you measure it before and after. What happens with what this performance does, etc. So this means also that in this research, immediately culture is decontextualized. It means you take something and one moment out of it, but you don't look at the general effect on the long run. So you measure indeed, but what is very difficult to measure is an experience on the long run. And how can you measure this? How can you do research on this? This means also, in most of all this research, looking to health, economic effects, etc., value becomes immediately kind of systematic function. It is reduced to a function. What does the performance do? Which effect has it on? So it is reduced or redefined, re-articulated as a function. While a value is something general, on the long term you have. And this I borrowed from a colleague of mine. This is in fact what this research is doing. It's reducing sex to reproduction. It is only counting the kids which come out the process, but it is not looking, or it has very much difficulties to look at feelings, trust, what is necessary for sex, I think so, pleasure also, I hope so. All those kinds of things are very difficult to measure. The only thing what this research is doing is, again, counting the kids, how many kids came out. This is kind of quantification of those values. Another thing, what all those researchers almost do, also quantitative survey, but also qualitative research, is in fact not measuring the value of culture or what culture does. No, it is measuring what people say that culture does. What did the performance do with you when you were looking at it, or what did you thought about it? This means also that you are completely you are measuring something completely else than what culture also does. No, you're measuring here a cognitive process, a reflexive process of talking about yourself, what your experiences are. So it is really kind of cognition, what you are already measuring in this kind of research. So, it was all said by Nan in the introduction, to measure is in fact not to know. No, to measure is to give sense in a specific way. It is culture. It is a way of giving sense to culture. So the whole policy of evidence-based policy, evidence-based research, is in a way giving meaning in a very specific way to culture. It's producing its own culture and its own values. It's a beautiful book, an old one already, of Michael Power, the Audit Society, who describes this very well. What is auditing doing with institutions, societies, values? It is specific, it is producing a new culture for these organizations. And I think, I hope also, Mieke van Hekken will recognize this also in education, in the educational field. So in fact, that's my statement, there is no evidence for evidence-based research. And we need to study culture in a completely other way as a process, what I call, of sense-making. And now I go to make a step to the other part of the research in which we think through what this means, giving sense, and how can you measure sense, or how can you study in a general sense, sense-making processes. Oops. And to explain this, I use my pathos. Probably you remember this. This is London moment, not such a good moment. And I will talk about this later, about this picture, what is the meaning of this picture, but there was a lot of discussion, you know, by politicians, mainstream politicians at that moment, the same moment or a little bit before in the banlieues of Paris. Sarkozy discussed this a lot, but also mainstream media. To try to explain what culture is about and how to study culture, I need this picture. So the meaning of culture. What I try to make clear first, before I go into depth into this picture and what is happening there, we try to explain also in the book No Culture, No Europe, that in fact the crisis in which Europe at this moment is, the economical crisis and the political crisis, is in fact a crisis of sense-making. This is a crisis of culture. For example, the whole problem that people in nation states do not anymore trust Brussels, Europe, etc. It's about trust. It's a cultural value. It has also to do, of course, with the other cultural thing, democracy. So that's the main thing we try to do in this book, in a way. We try to argue that also politics is based on culture. is based on making sense of things, giving meaning to things. We try to do this also for economics. In fact, the whole non-trust relationships between Germany and Greece at the moment, etc., has to do with trust relationships. And what is trust about? Trust is culture. That's for all the basic thing. And we frame this also in the research we did for Flanders. In the whole evolution we see, I think, through whole Europe, in what we call the move from the welfare state, or what we sometimes call the Rhineland model, to a neoliberal policy. Just to say one thing about it, I come to this later. Also, this is culture. Ideology is culture. It's making sense and giving sense in a political way to politics, to society, etc. We see in Europe, I think, a huge shift from this Rhineland model of the welfare state to a neoliberal model, and we see also that culture gets in trouble in this kind of shift nowadays. But I will come to this later. I will go back now to the picture. What is said about this picture in mainstream media and by politicians like this? They say this is senseless violence. That's the main term which is used by politicians like Cameron, and they say, we don't understand because it is senseless violence. And they immediately use the moral finger because they think we have to need more morality, stronger values for young children. They have no values anymore, etc., etc. So you see immediately kind of shift to a kind of moral discourse about this, what they call senseless violence. Already the use of the term of meaningless or senseless violence is very interesting, I think. Because, in fact, they think this violence is senseless because they themselves, those politicians, but also a lot of mainstream media, can't make sense of it. But this doesn't mean that it has no sense. And you know also immediately when politicians come up with this and a lot of mainstream media, another group is there to say this is not true. This is the whole army of scientists, philosophers. This is Zygmunt Bauman, for example, who say, no, there is a meaning to this violence, and this meaning, first of all, they point to the crisis, that there is a huge crisis, and they come up with social and economical inequality as an explanation for this kind of violence. Again, I think they're right, also the scientists. Of course, a growing gap in an economical sense between rich and poor at a certain moment provokes kind of eruptions of violence we had in the streets in London or in the banlieues of Paris. But I think it says not enough, especially not economy is not the only explanation, or the difference in economical status is not the only explanation for what is happening. And the proof of that you can find by probably in this kind of senseless violence, suicide. What is very interesting to see is in countries which do it very well in an economical sense, like Belgium, for example, we see also that the suicide rate is mostly enormous. How does it come? So there is a kind of strange relationship between economical growth, welfare at one side, and another kind of senseless violence, but senseless violence to the self, which is the origin of that. What I want to say by this pathetic thing is the only thing is that it is not only, it's something you know from, it's kind of public knowledge, money doesn't make happy. It's very, very simple like that, what I'm saying here. But it's very interesting what you see is in countries where the GDP goes up, there is a problem with suicide. Suicide most of the time goes also up. So there is not a kind of direct link between economical welfare and happiness, feeling well, etc. So in all this discourse of politicians, but also of scientists, I think there is an important thing what is, in my eyes, is missing. And of course you could already foresee, for me the missing link is culture. And what is culture doing? Culture is a kind of, what I call a kind of reservoir of science you can take out, and in which could give you the possibility to sign yourself, to give significance to yourself. So that's for me the main reason, I think, to invest in culture. Can be private investment or public investment, doesn't mind, but it is this kind of investment which is very important. And this is also what I think art is doing, is to give again and again, by this measuring, new signs, to put new signs in this reservoir with this culture, out which people can take signification for themselves, etc., etc. I think also when you talk about those riots, etc., on the streets, has enormously to do with, for example, not being recognized or feeling not to be recognized in a cultural system. And this is, I think, the most important thing what cultural policy or culture has to do in general, also the cultural sector, is again and again making other significations of recognition possible for other groups, for other people, etc. So, to put it blunt, we have to put Marx upside down. It's not economy which is the substructure of society. No, it's culture which is the substructure. It's the fundament on which we stand and with which we give signification to our own lives, to our society, but also to economics, also to politics, again and again and again. Okay, last slide. We make another step, and that is something what we do also in the book No Culture. We try to discuss politics. And I said already before, we see enormous shift nowadays in European, on the European level, but also in nation states in Europe, a shift what we call from the Rhineland model or the welfare state to neoliberalism. And what we also see is, of course, especially neoliberalism, that it takes, like communism, it's very interesting to see, also the economical structure as the substructure of society, foundation of society. What we try to argue, not to prove, it's very difficult to prove, but to argue in this book is that we have to inverse this reasoning and have to say that culture is the basis of society. And what do we mean by this? We mean by this that when you want to have a kind of strong Europe, etc., you have to build up what we call, and I know it's a little bit fashionable, a kind of commons, general commons, a common culture. It's not a shared culture. The commons means for us a kind of place where you can fight with each other, discuss with each other what your culture is. You can take position in the commons again and again. These places, those places of dissensus, debate about what is your identity, what is your culture you're standing for, is are very important spots, I could say it, or fields you need in a region which is called Europe to build up a kind of cultural coherence in the system. And this is, I think, in my eyes, the most important thing to invest in culture, to return this whole system of economical thinking in cultural thinking, also about, again, politics, economy, etc. I think I stop here.
Thank you, Pascal. Thank you. Hold your questions. There will be ample time during the panel discussion afterwards, and Pascal will be one of the panelists to pose questions about this interesting contribution. But first of all, I want to introduce to you Mieke van Hekke, former MP and Director General of the Flemish Secretariat for Catholic Education. And she will add the perspective of someone who knows all about the sector with a long history in dealing with the demands for evidence of the return on investment education. Please welcome Mieke van Hekke.
Learning to learn. Learning to do. Learning to live together and learning to be. I'm sure, better I hope, that no one will blame me for translating the theme of today's conference into the educational context. Not only is this my field of expertise, but due to its specific target group, children and youth, education is extremely sensitive to changes in society in two ways. Via youngsters, trends, and therefore the reality of broader social evolutions enter the educational sphere. Moreover, young people challenge the education system. A system with a guide in the process leading from childhood to adulthood. They challenge to make room for new realities, but also to critically adapt to the social currents and even to go against those social currents. The touchstone must remain the useful definition of the task of education that I cited at the start, and that was articulated by a UNICEF community headed by Jacques Delors in the mid-80s. I repeat, learning to learn, learning to do, learning to live together, and learning to be. The first two tasks, the transfer of knowledge and the teaching of attitude and skills, are educational tasks in the strict sense. In giving form to the other two, the point of intersection with the domain of culture in the broad sense, and I'm happy to hear last the definition of culture that is given by Pascal Gielen. In the broad sense of that word, the connection between education and culture is clear. In learning to live together, educational institutions become training grounds for preparing young people for a democratic, tolerant, and inclusive model of society, and for inviting them to do their part in realizing this ideal. In learning to be, the goal is to contribute to the overall development of the person in all aspects, from resilience, leadership skills, and creativity, to the discovery of beauty, being open to the wonder, and the quest for giving meaning to life, to their own life. On my professional path, I experienced that a number of social trends, however, inhibit or even prevent the implementation of these two last tasks. Because the European Union has set maximum economic development as goal, a very market and economic approach of education was taken when regulating and developing mechanisms for subvention. Curricula were overloaded with elements of knowledge transfer or reduced to more professional competencies. Only programs that could guarantee immediate usefulness were accepted. The personal development elements mentioned above were reduced or excluded. The second wormstand is the one I call the number fetishism. Only that which can be tested and thus captured in objectively measurable criteria is accepted as an element of quality. Positive test results, or in higher education, for example, a high score on the publication index, guarantee a positive assessment of the value of a program or of an educational institution. We love so much lists and rankings, especially when we are at the top. The real richness of education, however, is very often not measurable. Enthusiastic, inspired, and inspiring projects and professionals cannot be grasped in a questionnaire. Finally, I wish to add that a society which has a motto so-called neutrality, in France even more clearly defined as a society pursuing strict laïcité as absolute goal, ignores the craving need of youth, but also adults, for frameworks of meaning-making. Learning to be aims to take children and youth on a tour of major philosophical and religion frameworks, to guide them toward a critical spirit in assessment these frameworks, and particularly to invite and even challenge them to make their own choices, to identify differences and make them visible. When differences are no longer named, indifferences prevails. And indifferences leads to relativism and populism, because people allow themselves to uncritically be taken up in the delusion of the day. Learning to live together, learning to be, are not only tasks for education, but also a responsibility for the whole of society. And the conscience of society is located in engaged artists and other bearers of culture. So, let's work together on this, not tomorrow, but starting today. Thank you.
Thank you, Mieke van Hekke. I now want to invite our panelists of today, coming from all different angles of Europe, to reflect on what we heard so far. And I pass the mic to Diane Dodd. She's the European coordinator of an important global network, the Network for Arts Councils and Ministries of Culture. We have a fact sheet of IFACA, which is the name of this network, and we will distribute it to you afterwards. May I have your welcome for Diane Dodd?
Hello, thank you. Could I invite my panelists up, Peter, Abigail, and Mercedes, and I will introduce you first. I have to say, while they're coming up onto the stage, Pascal, you're a very brave man. There is no evidence for evidence-based research. And you're saying that to a room full of people, or I would say the majority of which actually produce or try to produce evidence-based research for a living. So you're very brave. And I have this kind of feeling, I don't know whether to hug you or turn my back on you, because it's one of those things we're always grappling with. But in any case, I'm going to come and stand in the middle here. I think both of you have raised some very poignant questions. And before we get into the nitty-gritty, tomorrow of really delving into whether we can produce evaluation that is relevant to our sector, I think it's very good to go back to the fundamental of what are we doing this for? Should we be doing it? Can we do it? And I think that you've raised lots of questions for me. Does evaluation lead to competition and thus, or worse, strip us of our autonomy? By introducing efficiency, measurements, targets, are we losing control of our sector? And I think we're all aware that it's very difficult to translate inspired or inspiring projects, as Mika mentioned, in just a questionnaire. So I think we're here to really delve into this and to see how we can represent our sector much more efficiently. I'll introduce, now that they're all mic'd up.
More or less.
I'd like to introduce the respondents, this panel, that come from different parts of Europe. Mercedes,
Giovinazzo.
I knew I couldn't pronounce it. I've been practicing all morning as well.
Don't worry.
From InterArts Foundation. InterArts Foundation has been working for many years on research and action research, making the case for culture. So I'll be very interested to hear Mercedes' response. Peter Inke, if you don't know him, he's from the Budapest Observatory. They have been observing, I don't know how many years now, Peter?
12.
12 years
15.
observing the role of culture and cultural policy, particularly in Central and Eastern Europe, but vis-à-vis what's happening in Europe. So looking at where they stand and where they position themselves. So it's certainly somebody who's been measuring for some time now. And Abigail Gilmore from Manchester University, head professor and...
senior lecturer,
senior
Diane,
lecturer.
But thank you anyway.
Oh, right. I've just promoted you. So Abigail has been working very hard on looking at this subject of how you get to the intrinsic value of culture. And I was very surprised and delighted to see you mention the analogy about sex and kids. Because later, Abigail, who I'm going to ask actually to come last now, so that you'll all stay to the end, is going to put the love into the sex. So none of you are going to leave now, are you? So that's good. So instead, I'm going to ask Mercedes to start.
Okay.
And I'd like you to respond to Pascal's keynote as best you can. I know you can, because you come from the Council of Europe originally, and if that's not a cultural project, I don't know what is. So I'll hand over to you.
Thank you, Diane. Thank you to the organizers, and thank you, Pascal, for your introduction. I had the chance to read the summary in English, because I don't read Dutch, so I have not had access to the full book, but I did read the summary, and I'm looking forward to reading the book. I was asked to respond from a Southern perspective, whatever that means. I guess that it's the PIIGS countries. I represent at least 2 of those, being half Italian, half Spanish, and working in Spain. It's a label which I don't particularly like, but that's it, at least in geographical terms. I have tried to structure my thoughts, and I will do my best to comment on your approach. I have to say, as a starting point, that I fully agree with your underlying assumption that no Europe, no culture, and that if this is a crisis, it is also a cultural crisis. I understand that crisis understood as a turning point, a moment of inflection, what psychologists call the transformation phase or phase transformation, means that one is getting prepared for something else, but one doesn't know what is coming afterwards. And as psychologists put it, the closer one gets to the inflection point, the one gets even more and more anxious, even more and more frightened, even more nervous, violent, etc. So that, I think, is also a measurement of the moment that we're going through. Your image is quite specific about that. Still, I'm not sure that I agree fully on the, or with you on the statement that culture, you say, at least in the summary somewhere, you say, culture has retreated to the background of the European project. That's true, but it has always been underlying the European project, and that's Diane's tongue-in-cheek comment. I do think that sometimes we do forget where we come from. And although we have to be conscious that we're living in a crisis, nevertheless, we have to look backwards. And if there has been something on which the European project from the second half of the last century onwards has been built on, is culture. The European Cultural Convention is 1954, if there is one. But I do believe that framing of the issue has come to an end. And I think that you have touched upon it briefly in your last slide, if I remember correctly. The profound crisis that we're living is not only of individual and collective values, it is of a political system. The nation state has come to an end. And it's the nation state as we have understood it in the past 150 years that has come to a standstill. Why do I say that instruments like the European Cultural Convention have come to an end? They're based on intergovernmental relations that mean that, or that rely on the notion of the total sovereignty of a nation state. You and I are equals, but we're different. And that's, to me, where the hic is of the whole process. Up to now, we have tried to square the circle. We're, united in a Europe which is culturally diverse. And this narrative no longer makes sense to anyone. You cannot defend being united if we're so diverse and we're so fragmented and we're so much lacking values. This is the first thing, the crisis of the nation state. And the second thing, coming from a Southern European, I think that we lack the notion of public space. To those of me who, like me, have a minimum background in law studies, there is the notion in the Latin and Roman, law, which is the res publica. For us, Italian-speaking or Spanish-speaking, it makes sense. It's your common space. It's what you refer to now and again in your papers. In English, it's translated, I guess, like that. But for us, the res publica is the public space where the art of governing is made, where politics are made. Either there is a public space where governing can be thought through and out by everybody who shares that public space, or otherwise we're vowed to a failure as well. There's a Spanish philosopher, Daniel Innerarity, who says that what is at stake for the European project is being less an interested Europe and rather an interesting Europe for its citizens. And that means, he says, that there has to be a different relationship than the one that now exists between states, nations, citizens, etc. And there has to be a European public space where a new political life can take shape. And that, I think, is absolutely fundamental, and that's where culture plays a role. Intrinsic value, instrumental value, I don't want to go into that, might do so later, but nevertheless, it's not so much whether culture has an intrinsic or an instrumental value, it has both, and culture has been instrumental to politics throughout history. It's always been instrumentalized. It depends by whom and to what end. And still, just to finish, again, I think that I perfectly agree with you. Either we make sense through culture, we're capable of, and I like your word, although it doesn't exist in English, this measure. Huh? Culture has to be capable of provoking a certain imbalance in what already exists, and possibly part of our responsibility as people who work in the cultural sector is taking up the role, taking up the responsibility, of fulfilling our duty and our obligation as citizens. It's not only a question of accessing culture, that's right, but there's also a duty and an obligation of participating in culture, but participating in political life, in the public space, and in the possibility of shaping a different political system.
Thank you.
That's what I had to say.
I think that deserves an applause.
No. Thank you.
Okay, Peter. No evidence for evidence-based research. What do you think about that?
I have always been advocating for evidence-based research, and especially evidence-based policies. And you are right, Pascal, that it has been a hype lately, so much talk about evidence-based, the necessity of evidence in policy decisions. However, there is a paradox, which is clear, that in spite of this talk, there is very little fact that there has been increasing amount of decisions based on evidence. So mostly evidence is, well, this talk is, well, lip service in a way, and legitimation and justification of decisions. So I believe that still, especially in my part of the world, in East Central Europe, or to be short, in East Europe, the decisions are rarely based on rational measuring. In most cases, they are, well, driven by legacies, by inertia, by traditions, by interest, by partial interest of a party or a group, of a person sometimes, simply. It's the prime minister or the minister's wife, so whatever it is. That means that, and although I say that this evidence is often just an empty slogan, I'm very much for it. Why? Well, how was it? Meten ist weten. But first of all, measuring very often is able to attract attention. It thematizes. So these rank lists that you were criticizing, they are good because they reach the media and the attention, and it is very much needed that there should be an attention on culture, on cultural issues, on discussions, especially again in Eastern Europe, where there is such a deficit of public discourse and public discussions and pressure from the civic society on the political sphere. So all this enables or makes it easier to discuss if it is brought to attention, to light. And also, facts. I don't think, somehow I believe that, well, of course, your research was focusing on impact research, but most often the research, the evidence research is not looking for the impact, the effects. It also simply wants to find out what is there. For example, what happens to your money, or how is the money, where does the money go? Very simple things like a blank sheet or a spreadsheet of previous years' spending. This is something which very, very rarely do people know about, or people don't, citizens very rarely are discussing how money is spent because there is no evidence, or the participation issues. It's very important to find out. Sometimes it is shocking to learn. Now, the Eurobarometer has these, well, rather rare, regular surveys on participation, on habits, on cultural habits. Last autumn was an occasion. And then you are sometimes shocked. And if you exploit this information, that is very important. Just one little thing. Romania, they are fantastic in their cinema. This year, last year, the previous year, they're always winning in festivals. And which country is the last, at the bottom, in going to cinemas? It's Romania. So such things. Also Poland. Poland is excellent in theater, in performing arts. And one of the countries where the fewest number of people go to theaters. Well, this is what they admit, but probably they are right. So these are very, very interesting things for the politicians. These kinds. It is not about impact. I don't know. I really agree with you that all this speculation and what? What if they go? What if they don't go? How much percentage it adds to the tax or the whatever? That I don't. I'm critical about the very self-assurance of the British science, which comes out at figures like 6.2. This is the contribution of so that is which I share your skepsis. So then the final thing is that what I want to say is that Jaron pointed at a very important thing when he in the greeting referred to the very similar researches in the environmental sector, as he called it. That's very important. So when the politicians on top look at our arguments, our advocacy, they are very neutral and very indifferent, because an hour before and an hour after, they will hear very similar arguments from the agriculture, from the tourism, from the foreign affairs, that they prove, they have scientists behind who prove that putting more money, more investment into that and that sector, environment is one of them, will add so much to whatever aspect of the economy. So this is why I also say that although on the one hand, I am still very much for more research and more, evidence in the culture of it, much more real knowledge about what happens. But I don't have much trust in the impact of these findings on political decisions. Thank you. No applause.
I'm just sad, the pessimism at the end. Yes. I think there has been a huge tendency now towards having to legitimize how we spend money on the arts. And certainly Arts Council Ireland, I think they've just gone through a strategy review. I think there's somebody here. Yes, who can probably tell us more about it in another moment. But this idea that they need to focus more on public good, because it is the public that is paying their taxes, that is paying for this. So they have to find that balance between public good and artistic development. And how do they do that? And how do they evaluate that? And how do they prove that in the end? So I think we'll have something to learn from you tomorrow as well. And, or maybe later today if we can get into some time for discussion. But moving on to Abigail. Everybody's waiting now with bated breath and expectation.
But I'm going to talk about love and sex. I did actually have some slides which I hope you'll indulge me with, mainly because then you can look at pictures rather than just looking at me. I have to say I feel probably as uncomfortable as I've ever felt with this headset on, so please excuse me. Rather like Johnny Depp in Charlie and the Chocolate Factory as a child. But then again, I do feel very comfortable with the terms of this debate, and I'd like to thank Pascal particularly, but every other respondent for the comments that they had. I just wanted to start off by saying that I'm from the UK. I'm going to be talking from a UK perspective, so therefore I'm going to be quite parochial and quite mundane. So I'm going to use some examples that I know of my working life through my own research, and that are mainly based in Manchester, where I'm based too. And I hope to be able to say a little bit about this picture that you can see here a little bit later on. I've been involved in discussions about value and evidence in relation to public funding of the arts and culture for about 15 years, both as a kind of research manager working with the sector, and more latterly as an academic researcher critically exploring some of the issues that we've been talking today, often in collaboration with arts organisations as a form of sort of practice-based research. So I'm really delighted to be able to kind of hopefully contribute something to this debate. And I wanted to look at three sort of main themes which echo current debates in the UK in response to Pascal's intervention, and also to the other things that we've started to raise around evidence measuring value, art and culture. I suppose before I start, I also think it's quite important that we make some more distinctions. I'm not sure if I do it very carefully here, but we should distinguish between the arts and culture a little bit more. We should also make a distinction between cultural policy and culture. I think it's Lindelof in an article I was reading quite recently says that culture in itself is not either pro or anti-democracy. It's cultural policy that activates culture's properties to do so. Maybe we also want to distinguish between evidence and knowledge. So these are the three themes that I wanted to touch on. First of all, as we've already kind of observed, the growing preoccupation with finding the right instrument of measurement. And what I think I want to argue here, perhaps controversially to this audience, is that it's the institutional framework which shapes the way that value is measured, and that this has profound effects in terms of reproducing social orders. You're probably aware that there's been a tsunami of activity under the umbrella of measuring cultural value in the UK as well as over here. Perhaps the best indicator, the best measure for this is the number of academic research projects concerned with cultural value which are currently being published. So we have the Warwick Commission on the Future of Cultural Value, which is being launched today. It's already been launched, a parallel launch to the Flanders Institute, Arts Institute Research. And we also have the £2 million Arts and Humanities Research Council Cultural Value Programme, which will be reporting later on this year. So the first theme is about measurement. Second theme is about the role of artists and the value of arts. And this ties into a current debate in the UK about the value of artists. There's also quite vociferous debate and campaigning going on about how we reward artists as economic animals, and actually how we train them and educate them to become better economic animals, and to ensure more equal access to these economies through education. So there's the hashtag Paying Artists campaign that's very active at the moment, for example. And the third theme concerns really how institutions can get involved in this, and how arts institutions and organisations can themselves contribute to social economies. This is obviously crucial during continuing funding cuts to the arts, as arts organisations and institutions become more defensive. So how can arts organisations provide more public value? And I want to argue that this is best achieved in the realm of the everyday, where art spaces and venues are realised as public assets, as common spaces. And I think, again, we've already touched on these points. So to take these briefly in turn, so we've already discussed some of the many exercises in trying to measure and develop metrics for cultural value. The increased instrumentalism of cultural policy has produced this obsession for robust evidence. And I was at a similar event to this, I think about 10 years ago, when Francois Matarasso called it a methodological arms race to get to the right kind of instrument. So we've already discussed the fact that the extrinsic values seem to be most important to funders and policymakers, to Treasury, how we can demonstrate economic impact and so on. But there is increasing interest in how quality of experience in relation to the transformative value of art can be measured. And this is just from a recent literature review by Carnworth and Brown, which was published by the Arts Council, looking at sort of individual or intrinsic impacts of the arts. And you can see that they've developed a number of different sorts of indicators. Here they are. They are to do with the event, obviously, because that's how we can measure and quantify. And I would argue that different stakeholders in these relationships will have different relationships to these different forms of value. So, for example, really the middle column arguably might be most interesting to arts organisations in terms of how they understand quality and arts experience, and the final column might be most interesting to funders. And so we see these sort of indicator sets being developed for quite qualitative or subjective or subjectifying experiences, which I think is quite interesting. I'm currently involved in a project which is funded by Nesta Arts Council and the Arts Humanities Research Council, which is a digital R&D project. And it's trying to do this very thing. It's trying to develop a co-produced metric set using some technology application with a large group of arts organisations across all kinds of arts forms to show how data can be brought together from a range of different stakeholder groups onto a digital platform to measure the quality of art. It sounds complicated, but in principle, they're trying to make it easy by using technology. So it uses a little slider app. Audiences can, or peers or critics can move their fingers across the app and they can have their experiences ranked and rated in these ways. And the aim is to triangulate data on quality and to co-produce a common understanding of cultural value. So I'm part of the research team that's looking at this critically, I have to say, in the context of broader literature review on this kind of measurement. And our initial observations are these. Firstly, that rather than answering a basic survey question, people like to talk about quality and qualitative experiences. They want to articulate their experiences and feelings in ways which sit outside of the audience development paradigm. Quality for funders means something different to quality for arts organisations or for critics or members of the public. It usually means impact. It's not about the aesthetic experience or how we might engage with arts and culture to subjectify or distinguish us, but rather what it might do that demonstrates returns on investments against smart objectives. The other thing we've noted is that there are obviously difficulties in establishing critical trust. Co-producing a shared value framework and sharing data cuts across the neoliberal model for the arts sector, where there's competition over resources and audiences. And also, metrics like these don't really deal with innovation very well, as the quality standards for those haven't been agreed yet. So that's what we call the rights of spring question. If you've got a new cultural product, then people they may not like it. It may get judged poorly in terms of its quality, but then, of course, that may grow over time. So the argument here really is that it's very hard to measure these things through hard indicators and through sharing data, and that a qualitative understanding of experience may be more meaningful. And for this, I just want to turn briefly to the second example, which is where love comes in. So this quote here is from Jeanette Winterson, and I said I'd be parochial. This is in relation to the opening of the Whitworth Art Gallery, which had a £18 million redevelopment investment and opened that last weekend in Manchester to much aplomb. Jeanette Winterson is a novelist and our professor of creative writing, and she talks about art and creativity in relation to love. She talks about it like falling in love. It's a disturbance. It's a reordering of existing material. A happening of art renews, replaces, and renames the tired old cliches. Love changes, art changes us. Now, this is quite pragmatic. The building wasn't ready in time. They had to move the opening. It happened to be on Valentine's Day. They tied it into love. It's all very good PR. But Winterson does go on to say, to explore the roles of artists in helping us to look and act differently. And how she talks about how they remove us from the instrumental of the everyday to create space for different kinds of cognitive behaviour and intrinsic experience. And I think this is possibly where the dismeasure comes in. And it reminds me also of some work by Lynn Froggatt, a social psychologist, who talks about this idea, the property of the aesthetic third. The aesthetic third is how art can transform people's lives and how socially engaged practice really works. It's a medium, it's a third for transformation because it allows a critical space where people can come together, where the producer and participant meet, and where they can take risks and avoid judgment as no one agenda is privileged. And so I think it's this capacity of art and artist which Pascal refers to partly in terms of dismeasure. Perhaps a more common term might be disruption or dissembling, where art helps individuals to consider their subjectification and question their position in the social order. Paradoxically, of course, culture, as Pascal points out, is also a form of positioning and framing and contains us within social orders. So art can both place and unplace us at the same time. The individual navigation of arts audiences, of these boundaries and taste markers that simultaneously place us, following sort of Bourdieu in terms of our different types and levels of cultural capital, I would argue these kinds of properties are understood by the funders, by the policymakers, and by arts organisations. And Arts Council try to help arts organisations navigate these boundaries through the way that we measure and we understand audiences through the audience development paradigm. And this is, I think there's a couple of people in the Arts Council England in the audience. This is a segmentation exercise that's been very popular in terms of an audience development tool, where we can see it helps organisations to identify and map such social groups as poor-time dreamers, bedroom DJs, and dinner and a show. And these segments position people on spectrums of engagement, creating a divide between organisations and their publics, since they're already subjectified in relation to their cultural participation, but in this way through an institutional value framework. So they continually make the distinction through these kinds of categories between active and passive participation, between being engaged and being non-engaged. And this is rather problematical because if you're measuring cultural value on the basis of who participates in this way, you're likely to be misunderstanding how value is ascribed by those who are actually participating. So my final theme is about how we can avoid institutional value frameworks while trying to understand the value of participating in culture. And here we need to consider the everyday. And this is in reference to some research I'm involved in called Understanding Everyday Participation. This takes the position that taxonomies of non-engaged privileges particular forms of participation and reproduces social orders and practices. And the project is aiming to understand how people value, and how the places and lives and social infrastructures are made through participation through an intense program of mixed methods research into the situated cultural practices in every day. So my role in that is to look into how that's happening in the cultural ecosystem, another trendy on-topic word in Manchester and Salford. And it's defiantly assets-based. It's trying to avoid a deficit culture of model where if you're not participating, you're not really here, you're not really in the party. So almost at the final slide, and thank you very much for indulging me on this. What our research is finding is that people who might be classified according to audience development frameworks as non-engaged are indeed highly active. They are making their lives, they're enjoying their lives through all number of activities, sewing, crafts, watching films, going online, watching football, playing football, meeting friends, volunteering, dog walking, shopping, gardening, taking their kids to the park. All of these things feature highly in people's lives. Of course, not so many people that we talk to actually recognise the formal arts institutions, the museums, galleries, concert halls in Manchester city centre in their everyday lives. The arts may be transformative, but a minority are highly engaged in Arts Council terms, but only a minority are highly engaged in Arts Council terms, around 8%, according to today's launched Warwick Commission report into the future of culture at value. The rest derive value from their everyday, and this is also, of course, a problem for arts funding model based on demonstrating value in the context of decreasing resources, which appears to misunderstand the wider public valuation of culture. So, very final slide, how to resolve this. I positioned a sort of binary between institutions and the public quite deliberately here. And I think it's partly because, from my understanding and also from the analysis that's been offered by Pascal, that the way that we measure and kind of quantify cultural value up to date just really reifies and continues and reproduces certain kinds of social orders. And so I'm just wondering how we can get around that. And one way we've already raised is by considering cultural venues as public spaces, not commodities, as assets, not liabilities. As local government arts funding falls by 19% in the last 3 years in the UK, this is becoming ever more crucial as the cultural assets in neighbourhoods disappear. Another way is to find common ground between institutional desires and local cultural resources. And I think that happens in lots of different kinds of ways. And also to consider whether there should be, and if it's possible, to have measures for critical trust, for creative disruption, for dismeasures, and for love. Is it even possible to understand these aspects of the arts through metrics? My final point goes back to the first picture and goes back to Whitworth Park. Institutions can excel at realising the aesthetic third, and many of them do best in the realm of the everyday. The Whitworth is situated in a park, and a lot of the work they do is about inviting the communities that live around that park into the gallery and breaking down the barriers to those public spaces. They have a very lively children and toddlers group that meets in the gallery space, and they're doing a lot of work in the park, including this launching of fireworks last weekend. And on that note, with the short bibliography. I'll finish. So thank you very much.
Oh gosh, I'm sure there's a lot there for you to think about. I'm sure many of you have questions, and I'm going to invite questions and comments from the floor in a moment. So please start organizing your thoughts already. There's another one of these mics that's going to be going around here. Just to say a few words from Ithaca, my organization, not mine personally, but Ithaca is a global network of arts councils and ministries of culture. And as a network, we've been grappling with making the arguments for the arts for many years. And we started tracking this back in 2000, and so we've got this fact sheet that we photocopied to if any of you are interested. I know there are many of our members here today, so you'll be well aware of some of the work that we've been doing. One of those is that we've collected a resource section on our website of reports and research that's been done by our members. And some of those reports are very interesting and very varied, from tracking the impact of the arts in prisons, for example, or the arts on environmental studies. So I would really recommend that you have a look at that fact sheet, and if you're interested, that you have a look at those resources. The question was always raised within our network as whether we needed a global advocacy campaign, and whether we could, on a global scale, make an advocacy campaign for the arts. And this has gone backwards and forwards over the years. And the problem, or the stumbling block, apart from language and apart from broadcasting time and practicalities like that, the stumbling blocks seem to be that our members felt that they couldn't advocate for the arts. That they couldn't say, we need more money for the arts, because they are the arts councils or the ministries of culture. It felt almost too close, as if people would turn around and say, oh, yeah, of course you want more money. Yeah? Of course. So, what we're seeing now is that a lot of our members are working very closely with other sectors, with other areas of work such as the judicial service or environment. And they're trying to get other people to make the arguments for the arts. So it was very interesting. We had a meeting of the European members of IFICA in Lithuania last year, and very young arts council in Lithuania, and the ministry there talking about how they have now decided that culture should have a holistic approach, much in the same way as health or education. It should be across sectors. And so what they've done in the ministry is to create a post, a dedicated post, for a person to work with each sector individually, making the arguments with the other sectors, or trying to get the other sectors to understand the arts more so that they will make the arguments. So that's just a little insight and perspective from IFICA on what's going on. But there are many of our members here, and those of you that are measuring and studying the impact of the arts and making those arguments. So I'm hoping that we'll delve into those tomorrow more thoroughly. But if any of you want to add right now a comment or a question for any of our panelists, I'm looking for a raised hand. Yes, because I want to invite Pascal to respond as well. But I was hoping there'd be more questions or comments before inviting Pascal back. No? You're all satisfied? I can't believe that. No, I really can't believe that.
Maybe.
Yes. Oh, good, good. We've got two. The lady in the red top, I think you were first.
Okay, thank you.
Hello, thank you so much for all your contributions, really interesting and inspiring, and raising a lot of questions indeed. Can I ask one to Abigail, please? I was wondering if you could tell a little bit more about the co-produced metrics on quality, because I'm getting very, very curious about that. Who is involved in that exactly?
Okay.
And how does it work?
Yeah, I thought that might be a bit of a crowd pleaser, actually. And it's very seductive. Okay, love and sex is back in the room. So it's the current project that I'm working on is funded through what's called a Digital Research and Development Fund, which is about bringing together technology, cultural and research partners. However, quite a lot of the kind of infrastructure for the whole project was already established. There was a consortium of mainly Manchester-based arts and cultural organisations that got together and tried to agree a set of questions, really, for how you might judge, you might measure the quality of arts experiences, predominantly around the idea of the event, so post-event surveying. And in some ways, that kind of approach is not terribly innovative. I suppose the main innovation is that it's not just about asking the audience, it's about asking, well, there are two main innovations. One is that it's not just about asking the audience, it's about asking critics, Arts Council assessors, peers, so other organisations that may judge. There should be a reflective element from the organisation itself, so everybody's answering similar questions or the same core set of metrics, and the public. And then that data is brought together through, whiz-bang digital technology and through these little slider things into a big dashboard. The conceit of it is that it's big data. It's not quite yet big data, but it has the potential.
And that's why I'm always also a little bit critical about this whole thing about evidence-based policy, because it tries to do something and tries to prove also something that there is for sometimes no proof in it, and to privatize fields of social fields. And there it started. Of course, it's evaluated enormously, etc. But I say always never forget what the starting point was of this whole thing, what we are doing now.
Any more questions from the floor? Yes.
Hi, my name is Luca Bergamo and I work for Culture Action Europe. Sorry, I want to take on this point of the evidence-based. Yes, it's a trick. The political decision-making is not evidence-based. It's based on the struggle of constituencies and powers. Evidences are used to legitimize political decision-making, but are extremely relevant to build constituencies. So the environmental movement has been building constituency for the environmental issue by producing evidences. Evidences where they were supportive of a narrative of society. So I think the point is that we need to be very careful. We need evidences, but we don't need evidences to build political decision-making. We need evidences and theory to build constituency in society that is demanding for culture, and then I get to the second point, role into society in a public space. Because the political decision-making respond to demands that are made by society. So this is something that I think should be taken in account in this process. Second is what should be measured. This is a very personal point of view. I think that we are, as Mercedes was saying, we are in a moment in this part of the world where it's the end of a long time of history and the beginning of a new one, where we don't know where we go. We have assets, and most of these assets are cultural, like the very same idea of, education for all, rights, women's rights, and so on. But what we don't have, and I think it's going back to the discussion on the introduction on the education, so we don't have that. We have all systems that we have been performing last year have been focused in building certain kind of attitudes and capacity which are instrumental to a society where productivity and competition were at the core, and where the fake idea that economic growth would have been generating distributable being was at the core, Margaret Thatcher and so on. What if today we want to go in different directions? Then we need to have wider policy which tap on education and some other things that empower people to develop different attitudes which are instrumental to society, which is based on different assumptions. Curiosity, empathy, trust, name it. I think that if we look at the quality of the experiences that people do in living or participating in arts, not culture in general, in arts, then we can start to find out whether if this experience contribute in the long term in developing this kind of attitude or capacity or not, and even compare how the education system works in terms of this kind of capacities. And I think these things can be measured because with we are trying to measure these things in the education system, and you find out that they are going completely different crappy. We can try to do it, with in our own field. I just want to know what you think here, because from your speech, you just omitted the old part of the research. From your speech, I think that there is a risk of ambiguity there. There is a risk of an ambiguity in speech, which I try to point out here. And an ambiguity is also, in effect, that I go back to Mercedes' point, is that we have a political responsibility, we now, in this moment of history, and how do we take on this political responsibility? Certainly it's not just to say that culture is a good thing, because this is leads us nowhere. Sorry for having been long.
Do you want to respond to that? Or do you want to think about it?
It is long to respond on, but maybe your first point. Of course, you can do serious research about and finding evidence for things. The problem is, and it's already in the word evidence-based policy, it's always related immediately to policy. And that's why also so much, or not so much, most of the time, so much money is given to this kind of research. People are doing research in this policy context. So I think there is immediately already a problem, I think, when this research is part of a chain between making policy and trying to find out what culture is doing. The question about what culture is doing is already directed by this whole circle of cultural policy. And I think this is the trap where this whole thing is in. And yeah, as a scientist, I definitely agree that you need to find, you want to have knowledge about what things are doing. But this is something else. This is really, it is directing your questions. It is directing what you measure and what you not measure. And there the problem starts. And at that moment, you are in a performative way making other culture. And making also other beliefs. And we all, including the beautiful scientists here, are involved in this process, in making this belief. And I think this is, that's why I'm so critical, ambivalent also about it. Because I want to find out what knowledge is and how it works, etc. But this is something else. And I know where I get money for and where I don't get money for to do research.
Pascal, I think Abigail is desperate.
No, just to add to that very much to agree to that. And I think you're right to point out that it's not evidence per se that's the problem, and it's not instrumentalism per se that's the problem. We want cultural policy, we want arts policy to achieve great things, just in the same as, we're talking about education policy. We want it to change society for the better. So, but I think there's a concept developed by academics from the Centre for Research on Sociocultural Change at University of Manchester and Open University, and it's called the social life of methods. And it's basically that how we measure helps to constitute the very thing that we're measuring and also the social order around it. So that discussion about our own complicity and the perspectives that we're coming in terms of what kinds of research we do is absolutely bang on. We're all complicit in this, and we're all defending particular forms of knowledge. But we have to observe that the ways that we develop knowledge, the ways that we develop data, the way that we may say it has to be an economic proxy will help to constitute and reproduce the order in which we understand those data. So that's just what I wanted to add. And I think that's also something that Peter picked up on too.
Yeah, I think it's something that we'll be talking about a lot tomorrow, is are we asking the right questions in the right way, to the right people, at the right time? So lots of questions. Anybody else? Yes, there's a hand at the back.
Hello, my name is Linda. I'm in the arts and in education, so I'm in between the two. And I mostly agree with what you said. But I try to look to it from another perspective. So I'm going to throw something to you, which I don't know if it does make sense, but it's just trying to opening something, because I have the feeling that we're not brave enough, that we have a sort of lack of daring to take another position. That we are all sticking so much as researchers or working in the cultural field, that we all stick too much to the methods that we are familiar with, and that we take a sort of very academic or even a defensive position or attitude to defend our field and to try to find all this evidence to show everybody how important culture is. But don't we have a sort of lack of imagination to try to do it in a different way? And maybe we have to work together more with artists instead of only with academics or cultural managers or whatever. Because we see how it's going now, the evolution that we're facing, that it's not really going in a good direction. So I think we have to sort of try to, how do you say, het geweer van schouder verwisselen. That I try really to make a shift, a paradigm shift or whatever shift, to be more, to dare to be more subjective, to dare to be more holistic, to be a sort of to come from a sort of organic approach, to be chaotic, and to be less methodological.
Now that's a challenge, so we've got to be braver and more chaotic.
It's very interesting. I did a lot of research also on cultural participation, etc., and exactly this came up at a certain moment. I think was the question. We see a lot of, I'm also a sociologist, you see a lot of sociologists who develop beautiful methods, and they can measure very, very precise and very well. But what I get frustrated at a certain moment, I'm talking now about 10 years ago, in research what we did here in Flanders, at a certain moment, nobody asked why is questioned these questions, and why it is that we have to measure this cultural participation, etc., etc. And at that moment, of course, I start to think much more subjective about what is going on, why is this kind of measurement things. And also, to add to your remarks, it is indeed, look at what we are measuring nowadays. When you we make this scan in this research, that are almost none of the questions which artists are interested in or busy with, or what is their drive. It is where policy is interested in and what is their kind of drive. So indeed, I think there is a kind of shift in perspective necessary. But I can convince nobody, also not the NWO in the Netherlands, an autonomous research fund. They are not interested in it. That's the serious problem, I think. So even, and that's my, sorry, that's my main thing. Also foundations, Mondrian Fund, for example, to call in the Netherlands, etc., get less and less interested in what artists need and are interested in. And that's the problem of all this kind of evidence-based research. There you see the shift and the legitimation.
Anybody else want to add something? Go on, be brave. No? Well, it's very interesting because I think we've also shifted the conversation in many different sort of parallel lines. On the one hand, we're talking about placing culture and the value of culture in society. On the other hand, we're also talking about making the case for the arts and funding for the arts and justifying the funding for the arts and public value of the arts. And a lot of evaluation happens because it's about just trying to self-improve, to be better next time, and to give more enjoyment next time, or better, have more people participate next time, or so on. So it's about evaluating the process for self-adjustment, if you like, and self-management. And sometimes I think we cross these boundaries too swiftly, but hopefully tomorrow we can separate them out as well. Would you like to add something, do you think, to round this panel up?
Oh, we don't need that when we have this awful red thing. You have one.
So who would like to go first?
Okay. Thank you. I was thinking as I was listening to the last lady who spoke, back to something which Pascal said during his intervention, which was, you said something like argue versus proof. And to me, the whole conundrum is there. There's nothing bad in proving something. There's nothing bad in evidence-based. I think that the problem is to what use that evidence is, or to what end, sorry, that evidence is used towards. And I just think of an image which is the lawyer argues a case on a proof basis most of the time in his daily work. He cannot work if he does not have a framework, which is the norms, and he cannot work if he doesn't have the facts. But what he adds is the added value that he brings into the process is his capacity to argue. And I think that right here we lack that capacity to argue. We are in a big hole of trying to justify ourselves of what we do, and always against new frameworks and new backgrounds and new metrics and new indicators and whatever. It helps sometimes in bettering our work, but right, fine. That's one thing. The big picture is what one doesn't have to lose sight of. And I think that we're not capable in this profession of arguing against an evidence-based. We're probably very good in focusing on the methodology, but not in then transforming it into something that maybe the person in front doesn't want to hear, but might be convinced of what we're saying by the end of the day. That we're absolutely incapable of doing. That's the first thing. And the second thing is that I'm appalled by the fact that, I can't remember now who brought it up. There's you, IFACA. IFACA has been cooperating with Culture Action Europe and with another number of big international cultural platforms, let's call them that way, ICOMOS and Arterial and whatever, in delivering a message towards the United Nations system for the inclusion of culture as a further goal in the post-2015 development agenda. The good part of this is that finally, people around the globe have gotten together in, let's say, at least acknowledging that there is the need to do something about this, and that's already a lot. But then we hit the wall very quickly, and the wall is that those whom we talk to, in this case, member states, the big, governmental system, says, no way, culture is everywhere. We're talking about poverty eradication, education, maternal health, whatever, everything's fine. But culture needs to be streamlined everywhere. So there, what you have to do, and this, it is the UNESCO, the agency for culture in the United Nations system that says, provide me with indicators, targets and indicators. And there you are, everybody know, frozen in the chair and saying, what? Now we have to provide in 10 days indicators that can go into an agenda on which people have been working for the past 3 years? But that's, that's the sort of discourse that we have. That's one thing. And at the opposite spectrum, you have people, and who in here does not have a friend who works in the private sector? Many big corporations today work on evidence-based, including cultural indicators to sell whatever, from cell phones to, detergent for washing our daily clothes. And they look at you and they say, oh, we do that already, it's fine, we already know, we've done that. So, what are we talking about, and why is this dichotomy still so present? And again, I think, and I'm the first one, and I say it, probably my Latin blood is coming out here, I'm gesticulating a lot, sorry, forgive me. But it is something that we have to think about, whom do we talk to and what for? And again, argument and proof, they're not contradictory in themselves. They have to work alongside. And I'm done. Thank you. Peter.
Yeah. Myself, who is a devoted number cruncher, so I like numbers and produce numbers and statistics and read and enjoy and analyze and so on. So I became excited by one of the slides that you produced, that you showed us about the distribution of the in the population of those who are active, passive, or in between. But what is very different is the equivalent tables from my part of the world, which I have been participating in producing, where here in the bottom you showed some 4 or 3% of people who are absolutely untouched by, so to say, formal or institutional culture. Now that in our countries is between 30–40%. So there is a huge segment of population who is outside of it. And what's more, if you look at the content, that is not only how many, the top, say, several percent, but what they do is they do
There's you, IFACA. IFACA has been cooperating with Culture Action Europe and with another number of big international. We've done that. So, you know, what are we talking about, and why is this dichotomy still so present? And again, you know, I think, and I'm the first one, and I say it, you know, probably my Latin blood is coming out here. I'm gesticulating a lot. Sorry, forgive me. But it is something that we have to think about. You know, whom do we talk to and what for? And again, argument and proof, they're not contradictory in themselves. They have to work alongside. And I'm done. Thank you. Peter.
Yeah. Myself, who is a devoted number cruncher, so I like numbers and produce numbers and statistics and read and enjoy and analyze and so on. So I became excited by one of the slides that you produced, that you showed us about the distribution of the in the population of those who are active, passive, or in between. But what is very different is the equivalent tables from my part of the world, which I have been participating in producing, where here in the bottom you showed some 4 or 3% of people who are absolutely untouched by, so to say, formal or institutional culture. Now that in our countries is between 30–40%. So there is a huge segment of population who is outside of it. And what's more, if you look at the content, that is not only how many, the top, say, several percent, but what they do is they, as you were listing, they consume a lot of things. They are really omnivore. So read, attend, play, a lot of things. So if you add up all this, and this is what we were doing, there is a huge imbalance, such an imbalance which is probably not matched by any other thing, not even income or education. So somehow culture, that is the interaction with culture, is distributed in the society in a much more imbalanced way than most other things like consuming goods or anything. So that is something which is, well, it is which provokes you to think and it needs courage, as it was said, well, anyway, reflection about it. That is just one thing I wanted to know. This is where evidence is very important. One more comment. That is, of course, there are two levels. One level is research on the effects of culture or the features of culture on a policy level. And there is a lower technical level that is the accountancy for the public money spent on culture. And this second is a technical level, which is very important. And this is what the arts councils and the other funders are doing when they follow up, they monitor, and they look. This is, the two things shouldn't be mixed up. This second technological level is very important, and it's important that its technology should be, how to say, developed on and shared in Europe between countries. And finally, One thing was, Luca, you were referring to the assets that we have in this turn, in this historical turn. And as I was reading the presentation, I was wondering whether from the three things, the three functions of culture, the socialization, I wanted to get to the third, subjectivization, yes, qualification and subjectivization, whether isn't it a feature of our culture, that is this Western culture, that here that this third is on equal footing with the others, that is the individualization, that it is as important for us and not just about finding your personal position in the society, but also emphasizing the dissent, the divergent thinking. So maybe other cultures, but maybe it is a stupid kind of European chauvinism on my behalf, these three levels are not distributed similarly as in our case, which may be an asset on our behalf.
Okay, thanks, Peter. Have we got just a few minutes more to have a final response from... Would you like to say anything?
I think I've had quite a lot of airtime, actually, and I'm not quite sure if I can beat the last two summations in some ways, or really add that much to them. I think that idea about technical accounting and its conflation or confusion with evidencing why we should take certain kinds of directions in arts policies is a really interesting one. And I'll have a conversation with Peter later about some of the data that's coming out of understanding everyday participation in terms of that huge divide between the engaged and the non-engaged, and how we might... I think the point there is that I absolutely agree that form of evidence is really interesting, and one of the things that taking a mixed methods approach does is that you can bring in critically different kinds of data and you can let them rub up against each other, and you can sorry, I almost went back to the sex then. And then you can see what happens when there are disjunctures between the data. So I think we'll have a conversation about understanding everyday participation outside of this. But no, I think that's all you need to hear from me.
Okay. Pascal.
You've got the last one.
Maybe two responses. The one to the subjectification, very brief. It's not only about individual level. I think it's really it is also to groups. It's really, so it's meant like that. So it means also, and indeed maybe it's a typical Western culture that I agree totally, but it is a kind of way of trying to emancipate, etc. Second response, proof and argument. Indeed, of course, there's no contradiction between proof and argument, but again, it is very well pronounced which proof is seen as a proof.
I agree.
And also how you come up, you have to come up with proof is very much fixed. So there is a kind of reduction, I think, from what we call the old European tradition of reason to rationality. Mm-hmm. And rationality is something completely different than reason in that sense. Mm-hmm. And I think there is something to win again, and to find other ways of proof, and to agree that there are also other things which prove things, like, let's end then with this pleasure in sex, for example. How can you prove this and make it hard in facts?
We had to end on sex. So I'd like to take this opportunity to thank you, Pascal, Abigail, Mercedes, Peter, to all of you, especially those who were brave enough to ask a few questions, to IETM, to Kunststandpunt and the deBuren. I think this has been a very interesting panel. I hope the conversation will continue downstairs, where we're going to have a drink. So I invite you all to put love into sex again, be braver and be more chaotic downstairs.
Thank you.
Ouch, my ears hurt. It's excruciatingly painful, my ears.
I was supposed to have one too, but I said